We'll continue our series on the Bible, how God gave it and how we ought to receive it. We're still speaking about the history of the Bible, asking the question, how did God give us the Bible? And we've now entered into this period of printing where no longer the scriptures are being transmitted by manuscript, but the printing press is enabling versions of the Bible to be printed in bulk. First of those was the Gutenberg Bible, which we mentioned, printed in Latin in Germany in 1450. And then a short time after that, we spoke about Desiderius Erasmus, who published the first printed Greek New Testament in 1516. So that is from the original language. In his lifetime, he published 5 editions of the Greek New Testament, and his work became the basis for many new translations of the Bible. Up to this time, typically those translations were done from the Latin, but now this Greek printed text was much more widely available, and people used it to translate the New Testament. And the printed editions of the Greek New Testament produced by Erasmus and other later scholars of that era came to be collectively referred to as the Textus Receptus, the received text, the text commonly received in Europe by those who studied the Scriptures. So one of those who made a translation based on Erasmus' work was Martin Luther, his Bible in the 1500s, published in Wittenberg. But then it was some time later before the Scriptures entered into English from the originals, and that was done first by William Tyndale. He published the complete New Testament in English in 1526 on the basis of what Erasmus had done. And he went on to work on parts of the Old Testament, so he translated the Pentateuch and Jonah, and likely also the historical books of the Old Testament. Here's a picture of Tyndale's New Testament. That was published in Germany because you remember in England you would be burned if you had the Scriptures at this time. So no one was willing to sponsor him to do this work. He had to go to the continent of Europe. And over 80% of the King James Version that we have today, that language comes in the New Testament, 80%, as well as much of these other Old Testament books, all reflects the wording of Tyndale. So he was really the one who laid the foundation for the English Bible that we have today. So we spoke about how he translated the New Testament, the law, the historical books, and Jonah. After him, this man, Miles Coverdale, who was one of Tyndale's associates, came, and 1 year before Tyndale was executed in 1536, in 1535, Coverdale published the first complete printed Bible in English. So Tyndale had published the New Testament, but now Coverdale printed the entire Bible. And that was published again in Europe. And he used Tyndale's New Testament and his Pentateuch and his Jonah. But he didn't apparently have access to the historical books that Tyndale had translated in manuscript. But those were printed by this man, John Rogers. He was another associate of Tyndale, and just a couple of years later, in 1537, he published the Matthew's Bible, which that included Tyndale's historical books, translated directly from the Hebrew. Again, that was published in Belgium. And so now, the half of the Old Testament, all of the New Testament was based on the work of Tyndale from the originals. But there were still the poetic books and much of the rest of the prophets that was still based on Coverdale's Latin translations. And then the next year, 1538, an important historical event in England, some injunctions given by Thomas Cromwell, who was the Lord Privy Seal, one of the counselors to King Henry VIII. And this is what he said. He commanded that ye shall provide one book of the whole Bible of the largest volume in English, and the same set up in some convenient place within the said church that ye have care of, whereas your parishioners may most commodiously resort to the same and read it. So now, an official of the English government says we're going to set up Bibles in every parish, and it's going to be open for people to read. And as we said, there were some 9,000 parishes in England and Wales at this time. So this would require the printing of many Bibles just to fulfill that first big order. And that was what became known as the Great Bible. And that was so called because he said that largest volume of the Scriptures. This was physically a little larger than the other Bibles that had been printed. And Miles Coverdale was now back in England, and he supervised this work. And this was printed in London, and it was a revision of Matthew's Bible. So again, the stream that began with Tyndale is even flowing through here into this official Bible, you see. And this is, the Great Bible's famous for being the chained Bible, because it would be there, available for public access, but it would be chained to the desk. And that was not uncommon for books to be chained places, because they were very expensive things indeed. And then sometime later, in 1560, in Geneva, John Calvin was reforming the church there. He had set up his Presbyterian church based in Geneva, and there were Protestants from all over coming there. Some came from England, and this was a place where you would have safety, at least in some of the ideas that were circulating here. And these scholars produced their own translation of the English Bible called the Geneva Bible. And that was the complete Bible was finished in 1560, and it was not the work of just one man, but it was several scholars together in committee working on these scriptures. And for the first time in English, the entire Bible had been translated from the original languages. So every part of the Bible now is coming straight from the Hebrew and the Greek. And we mentioned about how this Geneva Bible, people recognized that it was a very high quality translation. And so this quickly became very popular. As we said, it was the first complete English Bible to be translated from the original languages. Another thing, it was the first English Bible to use verse numbers. There had been chapter divisions in Bibles for quite some time. But here in the 1550s, Stephanus, one of those printers who was working on the Greek text, producing printed editions of the Greek text, introduced each verse with its own number. And those came into the Geneva Bible, and those are the verse numbers that we have today in our Bibles. Also, the Geneva consistently identified words in the Greek and Hebrew that were not in the Greek and Hebrew that were added for the sake of translation. And that is also in our Bibles today. So you see some words are italicized in your Bibles because the translators are providing those. Geneva, they were not the first ones to do this, but they were the first ones to do it very consistently in this manner, which became the standard. One very notable thing about the Geneva Bible is that it contained a really large amount of marginal notes in on the edges, in the margins. And they were not just talking about, they're not simple cross-references or little definitions, but they were explanations, theological explanations of the Scripture. And of course, these were produced in Geneva under Calvin, and so they reflect the theological understanding of Calvin. And then a few of them, we read one last time, were fiercely anti-papal. They were against the hierarchy of Rome. Also, some of them were anti-clerical, against the kind of the established episcopal system and monks and so forth. We looked at that. And so the Geneva Bible, for some of these reasons, was unpopular among the English bishops and some of the higher-ups. But despite its unofficial status, the Geneva Bible quickly became the most popular Bible in homes throughout England. This was not the Bible that was to be used in church. That was the Great Bible, right? That was the official Bible. But this, nevertheless, was so popular, people began to read it, and it kind of became the most popular version anyway. Well, a few years later, after 1560, The Church of England realized this, and they responded by publishing the Bishop's Bible. They said, all right, the Great Bible is starting to show some age. We need to just make our new Bible, and this will be our official Bible, and maybe this will just sort of sweep away the Geneva Bible. So the Bishop's Bible. This was one that was translated by the actual bishops of the Church of England. It was kind of divvied up to them, and they translated. Actually, they've been trying to do this for a long time, even back in the days of Henry VIII. He kept saying, well, one of these days we're going to have these bishops produce a translation, but it never quite seemed to get done. And even one of those bishops said, I think this work will actually be completed a day after Doomsday. Anyway, now the bishops have finally produced their Bible in 1568, and it was a revision of the Great Bible, but it didn't really challenge the Geneva's popularity outside of the church use. And that's when this man enters the scene, King James I. And he was born in Scotland, King James VI. So he was born to the throne in Scotland in 1566. But he was crowned King James I of England in 1603 at the age of 37. My age. I could become king. He was crowned, and so this was the uniting of the crowns. The Scottish crown and the English crown they were trying to bring these two together. And so he was both the King of Scotland and the King of England. As the King of England, he was also the supreme governor of the Church of England. That was a title that the kings had. They were in charge of everything that went on in the Church of England. Actually, back in the days of Henry VIII, they used to call him the supreme head of the Church of England. But some people later pointed out, isn't Christ the head of the church? And they sort of changed it to supreme governor. That word, the supreme governor of the Church of England. So the king was very intimately involved in the church. That means it became political. King James, of course, he was born to the throne. He was very well educated, and he wrote things. A very learned man. Also, he was a gifted theologian. He was familiar with the scriptures and the theological issues of the day, and he was very perceptive about what was going on. And he had come to dislike Scottish Presbyterianism. So by this time, the church in Scotland had been greatly influenced by Calvin and the reformers from Geneva. And so they had gone to this Presbyterian form of church government. It wasn't ruled by bishops, but they had separate presbyteries, groups of elders. And James didn't like this because he got in some dust-ups with these presbyteries that were somewhat further from his control in Scotland. And so he didn't like the Presbyterian form of government. He much preferred episcopacy, and that just means the bishop rule. He wanted to have the king appoints the bishops, and the bishops run the church. That's much more straightforward for the government of the church. He used to say, he saw that the bishops were such an important part of upholding the monarchy. He used to say, no bishop, no king. The bishops were essential to maintaining the authority of the monarchy. And because of these opinions, sort of related with this, King James disliked the Geneva Bible. You might say, well, what does he have against the Geneva Bible? Well, here's the seal, the royal seal of King James at this time. And if you look at the bottom, what does this say? Dieu est mon droit, in French, God and my right. What this means is this is speaking about that doctrine of the divine right of kings. In other words, I as king am the embodiment of God's rule on the earth. I have the authority because God's given it to me, and you dare not question the authority of the king because it has the authority of God. James himself, in one of his writings, put it this way: God gives not kings the style of gods in vain, For on his throne, his scepter do they sway. And as their subjects ought them to obey, so kings should fear and serve their God again. So the king serves God, but you people, you serve me because I am bearing the scepter of God himself. Nevertheless, there were some notes in the Geneva Bible that cut against this idea. One of those, for instance, was this, in the incident with Daniel and the lion's den. My God hath sent his angel and hath shut the lions' mouths, that they have not hurt me. For as much as before him, before God, innocency was found in me. And also before thee, O king, have I done no hurt. The note affixed to that verse was this. For he disobeyed the king's wicked commandment in order to obey God. And so he did no injury to the king, who ought to command nothing by which God would be dishonored. This seems to suggest people are only obligated to obey the king in that it reflects the commandments of God. We don't want people thinking that independently. Another verse here in Daniel, speaking of that willful king. The king shall do according to his will, and he shall exalt himself, and so forth. The note on that verse was this. So long the tyrants will prevail as God has appointed to punish his people. But he shows that it is but for a time. That word tyrant is never used in the King James Version. That is kings don't like that word, tyrant. But here it was in the Geneva. And it acknowledges that sometimes rulers become tyrants. And it's a punishment of God upon his people when that happens. And there were other marginal notes. For instance, when the Hebrew midwives disobeyed Pharaoh by keeping the children alive, the Geneva Bible said what they did was right, even though they disobeyed the king. It said, no, this is dangerous. So the political situation at this time within the Church of England, there were tensions between multiple groups. The most prominent of those were, of course, you had the Anglicans. That was just sort of the status quo, mainline Church of England. We're for the bishops, and we want to just keep doing what we've been doing. The Puritans wanted to continue to reform the Church of England. They said, look at all this. We still have all the trappings of popery here. We have, these elaborate vestments that are being worn and all these things. The Puritans said, we need to continue to purify the Church of England. Now, even further to their right, there were some people that were at this time beginning to be separatists. They say, we just need to leave the Church of England entirely. The Puritans said, we need to stay within, but we need to purify it. And then there were also some, you couldn't really come out in these days and say that you were a Catholic, but they sort of had sympathies with Rome. They just wish, man, if we could just go back to Rome. They were sort of laying in wait for the time when it might be right to turn back into Catholicism. But that would have been a dangerous position to hold. And so the Puritans, they wanted these reforms, and they hoped when James came to the throne that he might be sympathetic to some of their proposed reforms. Because after all, he grew up in the Calvinistic Scotland, and he would have been sympathetic to that kind. They said, oh, here's a conservative coming in. Now maybe he'll help us. They didn't realize that he would not. They came and the Puritans proposed, they gave this, the millenary petition, which just means it had 1,000 signatures of Puritan ministers and so forth. They presented it to King James shortly after he came to the throne saying, these are the reforms we want made. And so James said, all right, we'll have a conference to talk about these issues. And so they called the Hampton Court Conference in 1604. This was where they would get together and discuss the state of the church and what things needed to be changed now that James is on the throne. So who was there? Well, there was King James himself, his privy counselors, his chief ministers of government with him. The Archbishop of Canterbury was there, the head of the Church of England, the head of all the bishops. Other bishops and deans of cathedrals and so forth were there. And then there were also 4 Puritans who were there, hand-picked, moderate Puritans to represent the Puritan wishes here, which, as you can see, they were greatly outnumbered, which was not an accident. This was an attempt to deal with this Puritan question. And as it turns out, King James denied most of the Puritans' requests. They kept saying, well, we need to make this reform. And he and the bishops would say, no, I don't think so. And then they went to the next thing and the next thing. He kept having to say, no, no, no. He wanted to give them something, though, politically. And so one of the requests that he felt he could answer in the yes was their request for a new Bible translation. This was one of the criticisms. The Puritans, they looked at the existing Great Bible, the Bishop's Bible. They said, look, there are errors in this. This passage is mistranslated. This passage, we need a better translation. And we need, really what they would have loved is if you could just take the Geneva and use that in the church. That was never going to happen. But they said, okay, fine, we need a new translation then. And James sort of liked that idea. This was an account of one of the men who were there. They said this, after that he, that is one of the Puritan representatives, he moved his majesty that there might be a new translation of the Bible, because those which were allowed in the reigns of Henry VIII and Edward VI were corrupt and not answerable to the truth of the original. They had these mistakes. To which motion there was at the present no gainsaying, the objections being trivial and old and already in print, often answered. You can see the one writing this is one of these bishops that was hostile to the Puritans. He said, only my Lord of London, the Bishop of London, well added, that if every man's humor should be followed, there would be no end of translating. He said, you guys just, there's nothing's going to satisfy you. We'll just be translating forever if that's what you want. Whereupon His Highness wished that some especial pains should be taken in that behalf for one uniform translation, professing that he could never yet see a Bible well translated in English. But the worst of all, His Majesty thought the Geneva to be. So he said, I really never have seen a good English Bible. He said, I would like this. It certainly would be better than that old Geneva. That was the worst. And what else was part of his plan? He said, well, this is to be done by the best learned in both the universities, at Oxford and Cambridge, after them to be reviewed by the bishops and the chief learned of the church, and from them to be presented to the Privy Council, and lastly to be ratified by his royal authority. And so this whole church to be bound unto it and none other. Here, now we can finally we'll go through this process. It'll begin in the universities, it'll be checked by the bishops, it'll be approved by my ministers in the government, and finally I'll give my assent for this to be the new official Bible. And the whole church will be bound to this. Withal he gave this caveat, that no marginal note should be added, having found in them which are annexed to the Geneva translation some notes very partial, untrue, seditious, and savoring too much of dangerous and traitorous conceits. He said, all right, we're going to let you do this project, but there will be no notes. Okay, and that's why there aren't any of these explanatory notes in our King James Bibles. And so the king set out the parameters of this project, and now it was the job of the bishops to begin to implement this. And so Richard Bancroft, the Bishop of London, he went on shortly to become the Archbishop of Canterbury. He wrote some rules that would be followed for the production of this translation. The first one was this. We're not going to read every rule. But first, the ordinary Bible read in the church, commonly called the Bishop's Bible, to be followed, and as little altered as the truth of the original will permit. So the basis, the starting point of this translation is going to be the Bishop's Bible. So technically, the King James Version is a revision of the Bishop's Bible. That was the starting point. And in fact, they printed up several copies, especially for this, to give to the translators, and they marked them up. The third rule was this: the old ecclesiastical words to be kept, viz., or namely, the word church not to be translated congregation, etc. So they said, we've seen in some of these English translations the word church is being rendered congregation. We do not like that. Therefore, this translation is going to use the word church. Now, just as an aside, let's go a little further into this. Translating the Greek word ecclesia, which means a congregation, a local assembly of believers. This was consistently translated congregation in these earlier versions. So if you look at Tyndale's original 1526 New Testament in Matthew 16:18, it has this, "And I say also unto thee that thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my congregation, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." Or in Matthew 18:17, Jesus said, "If he hear not them, tell it unto the congregation. And if he hear not the congregation, take him as an heathen man and as a publican." And or in Acts 2:47, "And the Lord added to the congregation daily such as should be saved." Or even in the letters, 2 Corinthians 1, "Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, by the will of God, and brother Timotheus, unto the congregation of God, which is at Corinth, which with all the saints which are in all Achaia." Tyndale never translates ecclesia as church, consistently favoring that word congregation, and that is an excellent translation. That's one of those alternative histories that's fun to imagine. If this had always been in our English Bibles, congregation, would there be less confusion about the nature of the church today? Perhaps there would be. Or we might still be in the same place. Who knows? But nevertheless, Tyndale uses the word church. He does use it twice in the New Testament, but this was both in reference to pagan temples. Verses that speak about these men are not robbers of churches and so forth. That's talking about temples. So he never translates ecclesia as congregation. And you know what? This convention ultimately flowed through into the official Great Bible of 1539. So that one that they printed 9,000 copies of and put it all around the country, it all said congregation. When they came in and read it, they were reading, "And upon this rock I will build my congregation." Well, what happened? The Geneva Bible of 1560. This was surprising to me. I always assumed otherwise, but really it traces back to here. The Geneva Bible of 1560 always translates ecclesia as church, except in 4 cases where it refers to other kinds of assemblies. I used to think it was a plan cooked up by the English bishops, but no, it goes all the way back to Calvin and those in Geneva. Why would they not want it translated congregation? Because they were Presbyterians. They were not Congregationalists. Therefore, they said, no, we need to translate this church. That would be more fitting. And so it's only later that the Bishop's Bible of 1568, following Geneva, nearly always translates ecclesia as church. So Tyndale's excellent translation, congregation, was first altered to church by the Presbyterians in Geneva. And only after this move by Geneva did the Episcopal or bishop-ruled Church of England follow suit. Nevertheless, what can you see here? The English bishops are clearly still sensitive to this issue as late as 1604. That's why in the rules it says the old ecclesiastical words to be kept. Do not translate this as congregation. They still remembered this, and they were insistent. What other rules? Rule 6, no marginal notes at all to be affixed, but only for the explanation of Hebrew or Greek words, which cannot without some circumlocution be so briefly and fitly expressed in the text. So there's not going to be any marginal notes, except you can explain Greek and Hebrew words as needed. And then you can also see in the next rule here, Rule 7, such quotations of places to be marginally set down as shall serve for the fit reference of one scripture to another. So you can also have cross-references. And that's what we have in our notes today. We have cross-references, and you see some explanatory terms. So they follow the rules, but there's no interpretive comments that say, this is what this means. It wouldn't be a bad thing to have interpretive comments if they were correct. And a lot of the Geneva comments were good and helpful. But, people have tried to produce Bibles with comments. Inevitably, there are going to be comments that are misleading. You think of the Schofield Bible. That had probably some good notes, but then it also had these other ones that people would So maybe we should just stick to these marginal notes anyway. Rule 14. These translations to be used when they agree better with the text than the bishop's Bible. Tyndale's, Matthew's, Coverdale's, Whitchurch's, which that just is a reference to the Great Bible, and Geneva. So it started out, remember, this was a revision of the bishop's Bible, but this just let the whole thing loose. This rule says, all right, oh, and by the way, if you want to use any of these other translations, you may. And so these did flow through. And that's why Tyndale comes through so strong, although he was at the head of the bishop's Bible stream as well. They also adopted many readings from Geneva because they recognized, remember, King James didn't like the Geneva, but they still permitted the translators to look at it and to use it because they recognized the high level of scholarship there. Well, I'm afraid our time has expired for this morning. We'll pick it up here next time, speaking about the companies of translators who did this work, and we'll go on from there. Thank you for your attention.